In a quiet suburban neighborhood, life seemed to move at a calm and steady pace. The houses were all neatly arranged, with perfectly trimmed lawns and flowers blooming in the front yards. Most of the neighbors knew each other by name and greeted each other with smiles as they walked their dogs or watered their gardens. Among these homes, a new one had just been sold. It was an ordinary-looking house, but there was something a little different about the new owners. A young man named Marcus had moved into the neighborhood. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a confident stride. His clothes were simple, but they carried the air of someone who had lived in many different places and had many stories to tell. Despite the newness of the house, there was a sense of comfort about him, as though he already belonged there. However, not everyone shared that feeling. One of the longtime residents, Mrs. Thompson, a woman in her late 50s, was walking her dog when she first saw Marcus. She had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years and was used to the steady rhythm of suburban life. Any change, even something as simple as a new neighbor, felt like an unexpected disturbance. She watched Marcus as he moved boxes into the house, lifting them with ease and arranging them in the front yard. It was a peaceful scene, but something about it made Mrs. Thompson uneasy. At first, she told herself it was nothing. After all, people moved in all the time, and it was probably just a bit of the unfamiliar that made her feel this way. But as the days went on, she couldn't shake the feeling. There was something different about this man. He didn't seem to fit in with the neighborhood. He didn't have a familiar face, and there was something in the way he moved, so confidently, so surely, that made her question his place in the community. The more she watched him, the more suspicious she became. Marcus hadn't introduced himself to her, nor had he made an effort to meet any of the neighbors. He just went about his business quietly, yet Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but feel like something was wrong. Her thoughts grew louder, and soon they turned into doubts. Maybe he was hiding something. Maybe he didn't belong here, or maybe he wasn't who he said he was. She wasn't sure what it was, but the feeling lingered. One afternoon, when Marcus was unloading more items from his car, Mrs. Thompson made up her mind. She needed to do something. She pulled out her phone and dialed the number for the local police department. "I don't know what's going on," she said, her voice a little shaky, "but there's a man moving into the house across the street. He's acting strange, and I think he might be up to something." The words felt strange even as she said them, but she was determined that it was the right thing to do. She waited by her window, watching Marcus carefully as he went about his task, unaware of the growing suspicion on the other side of the street. She told herself she was just being cautious, but deep down, she felt a twinge of guilt. Was she jumping to conclusions? Still, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. As the minutes ticked by, Marcus continued his work, unaware that someone had already taken steps to question his presence in the neighborhood. Mrs. Thompson's call to the police wasn't an easy decision for her. She had lived in the neighborhood for decades, and in all those years, she had never had to involve the police over something like this. She felt uneasy about it, but couldn't stop herself from making the call. Her mind raced with questions. What if she was wrong? What if she was overreacting? She didn't want to be that neighbor, the one who called the cops on someone without any real reason. But the more she watched Marcus, the more her suspicions grew. As she waited for the police to arrive, she kept an eye on Marcus from her window, trying to find any reason that could justify her concerns. He didn't seem to be doing anything wrong. He wasn't causing a scene or making a mess, but there was something in his quiet confidence that made her uncomfortable. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Minutes passed before she heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Mrs. Thompson's heart raced a little faster. The police were coming, and she felt a mixture of relief and nervousness. She had made the call, but what would happen next? She couldn't shake the feeling that she might have made a huge mistake. As the police car pulled up in front of Marcus' house, Mrs. Thompson watched from behind her curtain, hoping for some answers. The officer stepped out, a young woman with short brown hair, and approached Marcus, who was still moving boxes into his home. Mrs. Thompson could hear the officer's voice, although she couldn't make out the words. She watched as Marcus greeted the officer with a smile, and she could tell that he was calm and composed. It made her feel even more uncertain. The officer spoke to Marcus for a few minutes, and Mrs. Thompson couldn't hear exactly what was being said, but it didn't look like there was any tension. The officer wasn't being harsh or accusatory. Instead, she seemed to be asking questions and listening to Marcus' responses. She could tell that Marcus wasn't upset or frustrated, which only made her more anxious. Was this all just a misunderstanding? Or was she right about something being off? She continued to watch as the officer and Marcus spoke, her mind spinning with questions. Was the officer going to ask Marcus to leave, or was everything going to be okay? It seemed like such a small, simple thing, a conversation between neighbors, but Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but feel that it was a bigger deal than she had anticipated. Just as the conversation between the officer and Marcus seemed to be wrapping up, Mrs. Thompson's phone rang. It was the police dispatcher. "Ma'am, the officer has spoken with the man, and everything seems to be in order. There's no cause for concern." Mrs. Thompson felt a weight lift from her shoulders, but it was replaced with a feeling of embarrassment. She had called the police over a suspicion that now seemed unnecessary. She silently chastised herself for being too hasty. The officer left, waving goodbye to Marcus, who went back to his work. Mrs. Thompson stood by the window for a while longer, watching him continue to settle into his new home. She felt a strange mixture of relief and guilt. The neighborhood was safe, but she couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling that she had judged Marcus too quickly. He was just a new neighbor, trying to get settled, just like anyone else. After the police officer left, Marcus continued unloading boxes from his car with a calm and steady pace. He didn't seem bothered at all by the brief interaction with the officer. In fact, he seemed to take it all in stride, just as if it were a normal part of the moving process. He carefully placed each box by the door, making sure everything was in order. It was clear that Marcus was used to handling situations like this. But for Mrs. Thompson, the experience wasn't over. She stood behind her window for a long time, watching Marcus carefully, still feeling a bit uncertain about everything that had just happened. Despite the officer's reassuring words, Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but feel embarrassed. She had made the call to the police, thinking there was something suspicious going on. And now it all seemed like an overreaction. Her heart still hadn't calmed, and the thoughts that had been racing in her head earlier kept returning. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off, though she wasn't sure exactly what. Maybe it was just the fact that she hadn't had a chance to meet Marcus yet. Maybe if she knew him, she would feel better. She took a deep breath and decided that maybe it was time to take a more direct approach. She had seen Marcus from her window enough times, but they had never actually spoken. It seemed like a simple thing to go over and introduce herself, but Mrs. Thompson found herself hesitating. What if he thought she was being too forward? What if he thought she was still suspicious of him? She had made the call, after all, and now she didn't know how to undo it. Meanwhile, Marcus had noticed her watching him through the window. It wasn't hard to see someone peering out from behind a curtain, especially when they'd been doing it for so long. But he didn't mind. He didn't think much of it. He understood that people were naturally curious when new neighbors moved in. After all, he had been a new face in many places before. It was part of the experience. Finally, after a few more minutes of standing behind a window, Mrs. Thompson made up her mind. She would go over to Marcus' house and apologize for her earlier actions. Maybe it would help clear the air and ease her own feelings of discomfort. She grabbed her coat and stepped outside, her heart beating a little faster with each step she took toward Marcus' house. She hoped that he wouldn't think she was making a big deal out of something that wasn't important, but she knew it was the right thing to do. As she approached the front door, Marcus noticed her walking toward him. He straightened up and smiled, his warm greeting immediately putting her at ease. "Hello," he said politely. "How's the day treating you?" Mrs. Thompson hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to start. But then she simply said, "I wanted to apologize for earlier. I called the police on you, and I think it was all a misunderstanding. I'm sorry if I made you feel uncomfortable." Marcus smiled again, this time with a touch of amusement in his eyes. "No worries," he said, his voice calm and friendly. "I understand. It's a new neighborhood, and I get that you were just being cautious. It's a big change for everyone when someone new moves in." His easygoing response immediately lifted some of the weight off her shoulders. Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but smile, feeling both relieved and embarrassed at the same time. It was clear that Marcus wasn't holding anything against her, and that made her feel much better. They chatted for a few more minutes, talking about the weather, the neighborhood, and how Marcus was settling into his new home. As they spoke, Mrs. Thompson realized just how wrong her earlier judgment had been. Marcus wasn't a threat or a stranger. He was just a man starting a new chapter of his life, just like anyone else. The conversation, though short, helped to break the ice and made Mrs. Thompson feel much more comfortable with the situation. She left Marcus' house feeling much lighter, the worry and embarrassment fading with each step. As she walked back to her own home, she couldn't help but think about how sometimes it's easy to let fear and suspicion cloud judgment. She had jumped to conclusions, but now she saw that there was nothing to fear at all. The next morning, as Mrs. Thompson sipped her coffee by the window, she watched Marcus once again. He was in his front yard, now working on planting flowers along the edge of the driveway. It was clear that he was trying to make the house feel more like home, adding small touches of personality to the space. Mrs. Thompson's eyes softened as she watched him. There was nothing strange or out of place about him after all. He wasn't doing anything unusual or suspicious. He was just a man moving in, like anyone else. As the morning passed, Mrs. Thompson couldn't stop thinking about their conversation the day before. Marcus had been so kind and understanding. His calm and polite demeanor had made her feel embarrassed for ever doubting him. He had taken her apology in stride, even laughing it off lightly. There was no tension or awkwardness between them. In fact, he had made her feel more at ease than she had expected. It was then that she remembered something Marcus had said during their brief exchange. He mentioned that he was the new police chief. At the time, Mrs. Thompson hadn't really thought much of it. She had been so caught up in her own embarrassment and thoughts that the words hadn't fully registered. But now, as she recalled the conversation, she realized that he had said he was in charge of the entire police department in their district. A wave of surprise washed over her. She had called the police on Marcus without even knowing who he was. She had reported a man to the very department he was now leading. It felt almost surreal to her, and she couldn't help but chuckle quietly to herself at the thought of how mistaken she had been. Mrs. Thompson had always believed she was a good judge of character, but Marcus had certainly proven her wrong. It wasn't just that he was the police chief, it was the way he had handled the situation. Despite having every right to be offended or upset by her actions, Marcus had been gracious. He hadn't raised his voice or made her feel foolish. He had simply accepted her apology and assured her that it was okay. The more she thought about it, the more Mrs. Thompson realized just how much she had misjudged him. Still, she couldn't help but feel a little awkward. It was one thing to apologize for a misunderstanding, but quite another to realize that she had unknowingly reported the very man who held so much authority. What if he was upset with her deep down, even if he hadn't shown it? It was hard to imagine that someone in his position wouldn't harbor some kind of resentment, even if just a small amount. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Mrs. Thompson opened it to find Marcus standing there, smiling warmly. He was holding a small plant in his hand, a peace offering of sorts. "I thought you might like this," he said, his voice friendly. "It's a little something for your garden. I know you love gardening from the way you've kept your yard so nice." Mrs. Thompson stared at the plant in surprise, not sure how to respond. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes about Marcus' character. He wasn't holding a grudge or making her feel uncomfortable. Instead, he was extending kindness. She smiled, her previous unease fading completely. "Thank you, Marcus. That's really thoughtful of you. As they spoke for a few more minutes, Mrs. Thompson felt the last traces of her earlier embarrassment fade away. She had been worried that things between them would be awkward, but now she could see that Marcus had no hard feelings. He was a man of integrity, and this small act was a testament to that. By the time their conversation ended, Mrs. Thompson felt much lighter. Marcus had made it clear that he wasn't going to hold her earlier actions against her. It was a new beginning for both of them, not just as neighbors, but as people who could understand and learn from each other. And as Marcus walked back to his house, Mrs. Thompson knew that she had learned something important. That sometimes you really do have to give people a chance, even when your first impression might be completely wrong. As the days passed, the awkwardness between Mrs. Thompson and Marcus faded completely. Their brief conversation about the misunderstanding had been the perfect icebreaker. What had started as a tense moment had transformed into a budding neighborly friendship. Mrs. Thompson often found herself glancing out of her window, watching Marcus as he worked on his house or tended to his small garden. It was clear that he was doing everything he could to fit in, to make this new place feel like home. On a sunny afternoon, Marcus was out front again, this time doing some repairs to the fence that bordered his property. Mrs. Thompson had been spending the afternoon in her own garden when she noticed him struggling with a loose plank. He was trying to hold it in place while also searching for the right tools to fix it. She stood there for a moment, watching him, feeling an urge to offer help. After a few minutes, she made up her mind and walked over. "Need some help with that?" Mrs. Thompson called out from her yard, her voice friendly. Marcus turned to see her, smiling in that same easygoing way he always did. "Well, if you've got a spare hand, I could certainly use it," he replied. She chuckled, walking over to the fence. "I've fixed plenty of fences in my time," she said, holding out her hands. "Let's see if I can lend a hand." The two of them worked together, side by side, securing the loose plank and straightening the rest of the fence. It was a simple task, but it gave them a chance to talk more, this time without any tension or awkwardness between them. Marcus explained how he was still getting used to the neighborhood, and Mrs. Thompson told him a bit about the area's history, mentioning the best places to shop, eat, and relax. It felt natural, like they had known each other for far longer than just a few days. As they worked, Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but feel grateful for this unexpected connection. Not long ago, she had been suspicious of Marcus, convinced that he was somehow different from the rest of the neighbors. But now she realized how wrong she had been. He was just a man who had chosen to live here, the same as everyone else, and he wasn't trying to make anyone uncomfortable or stand out in any strange way. He was simply a new neighbor trying to make a life for himself. When the fence was finally fixed, Marcus stepped back and wiped his hands on his pants. "Thanks, I really appreciate it. I was about to call in a professional, but I think we saved me a few bucks," he said with a grin. "No problem," Mrs. Thompson replied, smiling. "I'm happy to help. It's always nice to have someone around who's willing to lend a hand." They stood there for a moment, both feeling the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. For Mrs. Thompson, this was the final step in turning the page on her initial doubts. Marcus had proven to be more than just a neighbor. He was someone who shared in the simple pleasures of life, like fixing a fence or chatting with someone over the garden fence. It was something she hadn't realized she needed until this moment. Before heading back to her house, Marcus turned to her one last time. "By the way," he said, "I'll be hosting a little barbecue this weekend. Just a small gathering for the neighbors, nothing fancy. It'd be great if you could come by." Mrs. Thompson smiled, the invitation making her feel welcomed in a way she hadn't expected. "I'd love to," she said. "It sounds like fun." As she walked back to her garden, she couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. Her suspicions had been proven wrong, and now, what had once felt like a strange situation was turning into something much more positive. She was glad to have Marcus as a neighbor, and she was looking forward to getting to know him better over time. The day of the barbecue arrived, and Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but feel a little excited. She had spent the morning preparing a dish to bring along. Something simple yet delicious, a pasta salad with fresh vegetables from her garden. She was looking forward to the event, not just for the food or the chance to socialize, but because it felt like the perfect opportunity to really get to know Marcus and the other neighbors. When she arrived at Marcus' house, she was surprised by how inviting it looked. He had set up a few tables in the backyard, decorated with simple string lights and colorful cloths. A small grill was sizzling away, filling the air with the mouth-watering smell of grilled meats and vegetables. The atmosphere was warm and relaxed, and a few other neighbors were already mingling, talking and laughing together. Marcus spotted her right away and waved, his broad smile making her feel instantly at ease. He was standing near the grill, flipping burgers and chatting with a couple of the other guests. As Mrs. Thompson walked over, he called out to her. "Hey, Mrs. Thompson, glad you could make it," he said, his voice friendly and welcoming. "Let me grab you a drink. Can I get you something?" "No need to trouble yourself, Marcus," she replied, smiling. "I'm just happy to be here." Marcus grinned. "Well, feel free to make yourself comfortable. Everyone's pretty laid back, so just jump in whenever you're ready." As she looked around, Mrs. Thompson noticed that the group was a mix of familiar faces and newcomers. There was Linda from 2 doors down, her teenage kids playing catch in the yard. The Johnsons, a couple who had lived in the neighborhood for years, and even a few young people who had recently moved in. It was a nice mix, and the conversation flowed easily, with everyone talking about everything from gardening tips to favorite local restaurants. Marcus moved from one group to another, making sure everyone was enjoying themselves and that the food was plentiful. His easygoing manner was infectious, and soon Mrs. Thompson found herself chatting with Linda about their gardens, laughing at how her pet cat had knocked over all of her flower pots. The conversation felt natural and relaxed, without any of the tension she had initially felt. It was clear to Mrs. Thompson that Marcus had a way of bringing people together. He didn't just host the barbecue as a way to introduce himself. He genuinely wanted to create an atmosphere where everyone could feel comfortable and connected. As the evening wore on, she found herself laughing and talking with people she had barely spoken to before. She realized how much she had been missing the chance to truly connect with her neighbors. When it was time for dessert, Marcus called everyone together for a toast. "Thanks again for coming, everyone," he said, holding up a glass. "I'm really glad to be a part of this community, and I'm looking forward to getting to know each and every one of you better." The crowd raised their glasses in agreement, and Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but feel a warmth in her heart. She had been wrong about Marcus in so many ways. He wasn't just the police chief. He was a kind, down-to-earth person who cared about the community. She could see how much he genuinely valued his neighbors and wanted to create a space where everyone felt welcome. As the night went on, the party continued with more laughter, stories, and a little music. Mrs. Thompson felt a sense of belonging that she hadn't realized she was missing. The tension she had felt just a few days earlier was long gone, replaced by a new understanding. She was glad she had made the effort to meet Marcus and get to know him better. What had started as a simple misunderstanding had led to something much more meaningful, a real connection, not just with Marcus, but with her entire neighborhood. As she left the barbecue that evening, Mrs. Thompson felt grateful. It was funny how things had worked out, how a small act of kindness and an invitation had turned her whole perspective around. She now saw Marcus for who he truly was, a neighbor, a friend, and someone who had quietly shown her the importance of giving people a chance. The days following the barbecue were filled with a new sense of camaraderie. Mrs. Thompson felt more connected to the community than ever before. After spending time with her neighbors at Marcus' gathering, she began to see the neighborhood in a new light. People who had once been nothing more than faces she occasionally saw out of her window were now familiar, even friendly, figures in her life. It was clear that Marcus' simple act of bringing everyone together had started something much bigger than just a barbecue. As the weekend passed and the work week began, Mrs. Thompson noticed a change in herself as well. She found herself looking out the window not just out of curiosity, but with a sense of belonging. Her initial thoughts of isolation and skepticism had slowly melted away, replaced by a sense of community and mutual respect. Marcus had somehow opened up a door she didn't even know she had been keeping closed. One afternoon, she decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. As she strolled down the tree-lined streets, she noticed how much more vibrant everything felt. The air seemed fresher, the houses more inviting. She passed by the Johnsons' home, where they were sitting on their porch, enjoying the warmth of the afternoon. Mrs. Thompson waved, and they waved back, smiling. The small gesture was simple, but carried with it a sense of familiarity that hadn't existed before. The next few days brought more opportunities for Mrs. Thompson to interact with her neighbors. She bumped into Linda while picking up some groceries, and they ended up walking home together, chatting about the best local bakery. She also ran into a young couple who had recently moved in a few houses down. They were friendly and easy to talk to, and the conversation naturally shifted to gardening tips, a topic that always seemed to bring people together. But despite the growing connection with the neighborhood, there was one person Mrs. Thompson was still eager to get to know better: Marcus. She hadn't had much of a chance to sit down with him since the barbecue. He was always busy, either working or helping out neighbors, and whenever she saw him, he was on the move. She admired how much he was involved in everything, how he never seemed to be too busy to lend a hand. One evening, after a long day of gardening, Mrs. Thompson decided to invite Marcus over for tea. It was a simple gesture, just an invitation to chat and get to know each other better. She wasn't sure if he'd be interested, but she figured it wouldn't hurt to try. She placed the kettle on the stove and waited. Not long after, the doorbell rang. Mrs. Thompson opened it to find Marcus standing there, holding a small potted plant in his hands. "Hey, Mrs. Thompson," he said, flashing a friendly grin. "I thought I'd bring you a little something to thank you for helping me with that fence the other day." The gesture took her by surprise. It wasn't a grand gift, just a small plant, but it spoke volumes about his thoughtfulness. She invited him in, and the two of them sat down at the kitchen table, sipping tea and chatting like old friends. Over the course of their conversation, Mrs. Thompson learned more about Marcus than she ever had before. He talked about his career, his decision to move into the neighborhood, and his passion for improving community relations. He shared stories about his childhood, about the lessons he learned from his own family, and about the challenges he faced in his role as police chief. What struck Mrs. Thompson most was how genuine Marcus was. He didn't seem like someone trying to impress or put on a facade. He was simply being himself, with no pretensions or airs. She found herself feeling even more respect for him than she had before. It wasn't just because of his position or his kindness. It was because he truly cared about the people around him. As the evening wore on, Mrs. Thompson realized just how much her perspective had changed. She had gone from viewing Marcus with suspicion to seeing him as a true part of the neighborhood. He had broken down the walls that she hadn't even known she had built. When Marcus left that night, he thanked her for the tea and the conversation, saying how nice it had been to sit down and relax for a change. Mrs. Thompson stood at her door, watching him walk back to his house, feeling a sense of fulfillment and connection that she hadn't felt in a long time. The once unfamiliar neighborhood was now a place where she felt welcome, and it was all thanks to one person who had reached out and made a difference. In the days that followed, Marcus continued to integrate himself into the fabric of the neighborhood, always doing his part to ensure that everyone felt comfortable and included. Mrs. Thompson found herself looking forward to the future, knowing that with neighbors like Marcus, the community would continue to grow stronger. And she knew that, despite the rocky start, she had. Weeks passed since the barbecue, and the neighborhood felt different now, brighter, warmer, and more connected. What had started as a misunderstanding had blossomed into something much more meaningful. Mrs. Thompson found herself thinking about how her initial reaction to Marcus, the new neighbor, had been clouded by her own fears and assumptions. She couldn't help but marvel at how far she'd come in her understanding of him, and by extension, the entire neighborhood. It wasn't just the small talk at the barbecue or the casual chats in passing. It was the little moments that made all the difference. There were the mornings when she'd bump into Marcus outside while watering her garden, and he'd stop to ask how everything was going. Then, there were the days when she noticed him helping someone in need, whether it was fixing a car for one of the neighbors or giving a hand to the elderly couple on the corner. His presence was a quiet reassurance, a reminder that someone cared about the well-being of the community. One afternoon, as Mrs. Thompson was sitting on her porch enjoying the warm breeze, she saw Marcus walking toward her house with a friendly smile on his face. He was holding a small box, and she couldn't help but wonder what it was. He had become such a fixture in the neighborhood, and his kindness had left an impression on everyone he met. "Hey, Mrs. Thompson," he called out as he approached. "I wanted to drop something off for you." She stood up, curious, and met him halfway. "What's this?" she asked, her voice light with amusement. "Just a little something," Marcus said with a smile. "I thought you might like it." She took the box from him and opened it. Inside was a small, hand-carved wooden bird, a delicate, beautiful piece of art. The craftsmanship was remarkable, and Mrs. Thompson couldn't believe it. "Marcus, this is beautiful," she said, genuinely touched. "Where did you get this?" Marcus shrugged, looking slightly embarrassed. "A friend of mine makes them. I thought it would be a nice addition to your garden. I've seen you out there a lot, and I figured it might bring a little more beauty to it." Mrs. Thompson was speechless for a moment. The simple gesture made her heart swell with gratitude. "I don't know what to say," she finally said. "This is so thoughtful of you." "It's nothing," Marcus replied, though his smile showed he was pleased by her reaction. "Just thought I'd brighten your day a little." As they stood there talking, Mrs. Thompson realized that what made Marcus so different wasn't just his role as the police chief or his willingness to help. It was his ability to connect with people, to make them feel valued and heard. In a world where people often rushed past each other, too busy with their own lives, Marcus had a way of slowing things down, of taking the time to make a real difference. The next few days were filled with even more moments of connection. Mrs. Thompson spent more time with her neighbors, and the bond between them deepened. She found herself getting involved in the small community projects that Marcus had quietly started, whether it was organizing a neighborhood cleanup or planning a spring picnic for everyone to enjoy. Slowly, but surely, the neighborhood was becoming a place where people didn't just live next to each other. They looked out for one another, offering help and support without hesitation. One evening, as the sun began to set, Mrs. Thompson found herself sitting on her porch once again, watching the neighborhood come alive with the soft glow of streetlights and the sound of laughter drifting from nearby homes. It felt peaceful, and for the first time in a long while, she felt completely at home. She saw Marcus walk by, heading toward his house. As he passed, he waved, and she waved back. Their connection had grown beyond just being neighbors. It had turned into a true friendship. It was funny how life worked sometimes, how a simple mistake had led to something so much more beautiful. For Mrs. Thompson, that moment was the culmination of everything she had learned over the past few weeks. She had been quick to judge, quick to assume the worst, but she had also been open enough to change her mind, to let go of her doubts and embrace the possibility of new connections. And in doing so, she had found not only a good neighbor in Marcus, but also a friend who had shown her the value of community, kindness, and understanding. As the evening grew darker, Mrs. Thompson sat back in her chair, smiling to herself. She was grateful for the new chapter in her life, one that had begun with a simple misunderstanding and blossomed into something she had never expected, but now cherished deeply.